Hello, folks. Welcome back to World War II TV, and we are continuing our Tunis to Torch. Our Torch to Tunis series is better than Tunis to Torch. We are continuing with a look at the events of the arrival of Patton. We had talked about him a little bit with Vince O'Hara in terms of where he was in the naval battle of Casablanca, and Mark Calhoun took us through the Kasserine Pass, the German counteroffensives, but now we're talking about the arrival of the Second Corps and Patton's involvement and Task Force Benson. My guest is Kevin Hymel. He's a regular on D-Day on the subjects on our channel, but also talks about General Patton. He talks about everything. This is the first volume of his Patton's War book. The second volume is out now, but it's not quite ready for pre-order in some internet sources, and some it is. But the first book is the one that covers what we're talking about tonight. So the links to that are in the description below. But I'm going to bring Kevin in now. And good afternoon, Kevin. How are you today?
Hey, Paul. Good to see you, man. I
just happen to
have a copy of this on me right now. So that's volume 2, which should be coming out, I think, in about 2 weeks.
Brilliant.
I was able to get an early copy. So very excited to talk about that. But we're not going to talk about that. We're going to talk about what's in volume 1 with Task Force Benson. I'm very excited to talk about that.
And, you know, as we discussed with Mark last week with the presentation about Kasserine Pass, that is the story that kind of symbolizes the Americans in this part of North Africa. Kasserine Pass is in the Big Red 1 movie. It's in the video games and things like that. But actually, there's a lot more that happened before that, and there's a lot more that happened after that. And Patton's arrival, it coincides with more of an aggressive stance by the Americans, because the German counteroffensives had kind of rattled things across Allied command. So it was kind of perfect time for Patton to kind of unleash the type of ideas he had. So when you were studying this, I know we were talking before we were going online, Task Force Benson, which our subject tonight, is one of those things that you struggle to find a lot about it written down, yet it's actually quite a key engagement.
Yes, very much so. In fact, when you and I talked about this topic, I went to the archives because I'd really, writing the book on Patton, I was really looking at Task Force Benson through Patton's eyes. But when we talked about this topic for the show, I thought, well, you know what, I need to go to the archives, pull records, see what I can find. And what was interesting, first of all, I couldn't find Task Force Benson in the 1st Armored Division records because Patton pulled it out, kind of created the task force himself at Second Corps headquarters. So I actually went through Second Corps records, and all I could find regarding Task Force Benson was a file on the G2 report. I'm sorry, the intelligence report,
right.
Basically of what was facing Task Force Benson. And actually, when I pulled the boxes, I couldn't even find the file. So it is one of those sort of forgotten pieces of history. And I think really the Army Green books on World War II, the operational history of World War II, that's where you can basically find the most on Task Force Benson. And that's what I drew from heavily for my book, as well as what Patton remembered and some, takes from other people around him.
Brilliant. And as we'll discover, it's not just the task force itself, it's where this sits into the context of the learning curve. That's the thing. The American forces that landed in Torch are having to learn the game very, very quickly. The British forces, who are there sometimes alongside, have been in the desert for 2 years by this point. But you're new to the fight. This is your first engagement against Germans in the ETO, on the ground, and you're having to play catch up really quickly with a war that both ally and enemy have been involved in for some time and have got quite good at it in some regards. So it's so Patton is coming into the game where the game is halfway through, and he's now got to make his own mark on it and bring his ideas to something. So, well, you've sent me lots of photos which will take us through, so I'm going to hand over to you, Kevin, and I'll try and kind of follow where you are, lead with some maps, but just kind of give us a summary of where we are in March 1943, kind of post Kasserine Pass. What's going on from the American perspective?
Sure. So, Kasserine is a very stinging attack against the Americans, kind of leaves the Americans reeling. They really haven't fought the Germans at this point in a defensive action. They really land and fight against French colonial troops in Morocco and Tunis and things like that. So that's a quick 3-day fight at the most, Operation Torch in November. And then Second Corps under Fredenal starts to travel east and then kind of becomes part of the British line and the British First Army. And it's there that they get this stinging attack by, I guess, it's not von Mellenthin, but von Arman,
Yeah.
followed by Rommel. And it really shows deficiency in equipment and in arms and coordination. And so when Patton arrives, he's really kind of the man of action, moving around. Teddy Roosevelt Jr. said after his first meeting, he said, we finally got a fighter, in charge, and was really happy about that. Patton wanted to get the Army sort of revamped and moving again, or his Second Corps revamped and moving again. He goes around kind of kicking butt. It really is obvious. He definitely favors armor units to infantry. He's definitely harsher on the infantry guys, who really do the majority of the fighting. But within 12 days, he kind of has the Army kind of take a deep breath and go back on the attack. And it's at a place called El Guettar after an advance of about 10 miles that the Germans counterattack. And the credit really goes to Terry Allen, the commander of the 1st Infantry Division. He sends, he's sending troops and tanks, tank destroyers into the line, buying time for reinforcements. Patton is really just sending him everything he can think of, including ammunition, to enable Terry Allen to fight this fight. And it is a defensive victory. Patton does make some key decisions that help with it. But like I said, it's Terry Allen's victory. And sort of with this momentum from El Guettar, that Patton's Second Corps starts pressing east. And the idea is to, intercept Montgomery's troops coming up from the south and basically either capture the Germans under von Arman at this point. Rommel's gone, or at least cut him in half. And so for this, Patton is just hammering away. And he's got about 4 divisions with him. He's got Terry Allen's 1st, which we mentioned. He's got Mantonetti's 9th, which is new to combat. He's got Orlando Ward's 1st Armored Division, which to Patton is not showing enough aggression. And then finally, Ryder with the 34th Infantry Division. So these are the units he has. This is what he's going to press forward with. And he's really hammering away on Ward. He's expecting armor to kind of win the day. And Ward, for his part, is up in a very rocky area fighting some serious, strong German, and I don't even want to call it German resistance because there's so many counterattacks against 1st Armored. And I think Ward has been a bit maligned because everything we read about North Africa really is through Patton's eyes. And he's not up at Magnassi, which is where he's fighting as much, and isn't getting a feel of the terrain, the strength of the Germans. So yeah, there's Ward right there. And I found that photograph of Patton in Tunisia, and I thought it was unique for several reasons. One, you'll notice he's only wearing 1 ivory-handled pistol. He really stops wearing 2 ivory-handled pistols after Morocco. You never see it again, and I'm always encountering GIs saying, oh, and Patton walked up to me in Germany with 2 ivory-handled pistols. No, he didn't. He only had 1. And if you notice his jacket, they always talk about Patton and his famous Eisenhower jacket with the gold buttons and all the ribbons. Well, he got that in England in 44. So that's kind of the battle dress he was wearing in North Africa. And if you notice that there's a small pouch on the front of his belt, that's actually a handcuff case from a policeman that Patton got his hands on, and he would keep his compass in there. So as I digress. As I was
we like a good rabbit hole on a Monday
Exactly.
afternoon or Monday evening. It's great, and what a great photo as well.
Yeah, no one ever complains about Patton details to me. They go, yay. So anyways, yeah, he feels like Ward is not pulling his weight. He keeps ordering him back into the fight to take these heights and those heights. And Ward is just having a lot of difficulty with it, and Patton doesn't appreciate it. By the way, I should mention that after the war, Ward is going to oversee the writing of the history of World War II, what are known as the Army Green Books. And so if you go into an Army Green Book and you look at the first page, if there's a letter by Orlando Ward telling you what you're about to look at. So anyway, so these are the frustrations Patton's dealing with. He wants his infantry pressing ahead, and it's really the first infantry that's doing the job. Mantonetti's 9th is having a lot of difficulties. They're not used to combat. They're taking heavy casualties, and Ryder with the 34th has really been assigned sort of feigning tactics, try to draw the Germans away for the main attack, and just nothing seems to be working. You know, Patton's got all these brilliant ideas, but he has a green, you know, corps that he's commanding against very experienced German commanders. So he gets this idea in the end of March. You know, if Orlando Ward isn't going to press through with armor, I'll do it myself. So he, you know, basically takes away 2 battalions of tanks, a reconnaissance battalion, 2 field artillery battalions, a tank destroyer battalion, so a company of engineers, and some motorized infantry that he's going to take from Mantonetti's 9th and created this task force. And I should mention, people always ask, you know, what exactly is a task force? And the answer is nobody knows.
It's whatever what anyone wants it to be on that particular day. Yeah, it could be 3 guys or core. Yeah.
Yes. What is the objective? What do I need to take the objective? I'll create a task force in the size that I need. And so there you have the listing of what's going to be used in the task force right there. And he's going to put in charge of it Colonel Clarence, known as Chauncey Benson. And this is an officer who served with Patton in World War I in Patton's tank corps. There he is right in front of you. And I should mention this, the officer writing something down with a pen behind him. That's Dick Jensen, Patton's aide, who's going to be killed on April 1st. And we can go into that a little bit. I know we want to focus on Task Force Benson. We could do a whole other episode on Dick Jensen. And so the idea is Patton's infantry, he's given up on his armor. He's given up on 1st Armored Division. So his infantry is going to press forward. And when they can make a breach in the line, and, you know, we're looking at, I'm going to have to put on my nerd goggles. You know, they're already through Gasfa. You can see El Guettar down there at the bottom.
Yep.
And then you can see all that activity just to the east of El Guettar. So that's where he's looking to make the breakthrough.
And I think while we got that map up there, we need to kind of reference that kind of semicircular string of hills in the kind of the lower middle part there, because that's all where, and I'll put up the Task Force Benson map in a minute, but that's the terrain there, that because it's kind of flat, and then there are these massive great rises there, and you'll see that, folks, in a minute when we have the photos up, because the terrain is interesting. And when we do the show with Trevor Sheehan next week, he'll have lots of wonderful footage from this area. We can get a real understanding of what the terrain is like, and that's the one actually showing. You can see in the middle of the map there, folks, where it says Benson, and that's kind of those arrows are pushing towards that bit of high ground. And just to kind of talk about this, the end of the German counter-offensives, Kevin, is that later on, both in Italy and in Normandy and elsewhere, the Allies learned that after a German counter-offensive comes to a sort of a shuddering halt, that's the moment to strike. That's the moment to capitalize. And it's recognizing when a German offensive has kind of run out of steam. And if you leave it too long before you're mounting your own offensive, they have already started going on the defensive and started kind of preparing again. So you've got to catch them at that moment when they're reeling. But it's recognizing when their offensive has come to a halt. You know, is it petering out, or is it actually over? And obviously this coincides with Patton's whole ethos of war is, you know, strike first, strike hard. And it's interesting that this is coming together now in this period of the campaign.
Yeah, but let's leave that map up for a sec, because just to follow on exactly what you're saying, because you're right on the money with that. You know, Patton's idea is for the infantry to push forward, and wherever a breach occurs, he's going to send Task Force Benson through there. That's going to be the exploitation element. But, you know, and the hardest thing to do is find out when that pause is. Yeah. Especially with a green army, with green commanders. You know, that really takes a certain battlefield sense that you can only get from experience. And it's funny you mentioned that, because I was encountering the same thing when I worked for the army, writing about Afghanistan, that the Taliban would attack in a certain way, and then there would be a pause, and that's when the American troops would know to fight back. So that's something that is not exclusive to the Germans. That is a common element of warfare right up to the present. So anyways, he puts this unit together, and of course you've got elements that have never fought together. And one of the things that's really going to drive Patton crazy is when he pulls the artillery from 1st Armored Division. You know, he tells Ward, move them at night so that we can surprise the Germans when they appear on this other side of the battlefield. And of course they don't arrive on time. They arrive after sunrise. Patton's furious, and this is going to lead to the end of Orlando Ward. He's going to put Ernie Harmon in charge of 1st Armored, who's going to be much more aggressive. but it's the putting together of Task Force Benson that leads towards demise. Patton's orders are very simple to Benson. He basically tears a piece of paper out of a notebook and he jots down, attack and destroy the enemy, act aggressively, GSP Jr. That's his entire frago. That's his entire order, attack aggressively. And so on March 29th, Patton sends the infantry forward. The 9th takes a bit of a beating. There's reports of entire battalions surrendering. It turns out it's not. It was like a platoon. And Patton's sitting there trying to time, when do I launch Benson's force? When is that right moment? And he gets up to the front, and it's reported that the Army Group Commander, General Alexander, has made the call, even though he told Patton it was his call, and decided not to launch Benson's task force. And Patton is furious. Tell me what you need me to do. Don't tell me how to do it. Which is a very big principle, very big difference, I want to say, between the American and the British Army. Maybe that's just an American perspective, but this really kind of raggles him. And he goes to Mantonetti, the 9th Infantry, and he starts chewing him out for not doing a good enough job. And Mantonetti later says, like, oh my God, in my entire career, I've never been yelled at by a superior officer the way I've been yelled at Patton. And that pattern is going to continue for the next 7 days of Patton just kind of losing his mind at Eddie. In fact, at one point, he shows up at his headquarters and he says, Eddie, you're not getting enough officers killed. You need to get more lieutenants into the field and get them killed. And one of Eddie's staff officers just kind of has a nervous breakdown, and they got to kind of carry him away. This aggressiveness that Patton is bringing to the battlefield is really kind of rattling a lot of people. But once the 9th Infantry finally does kind of make that breakthrough, Patton orders Benson forward, and he says, hey, you 9th Infantry guys, you did a good job. Now just sit back and watch my armor, my killers go to work. And he sends, Benson's force in, and then boom, 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 American tanks just go up in flames. And so it's just kind of a huge debacle. Patton really doesn't appreciate, I think, the strength and experience of the German army. They might be very weak at this point of the war, but they're very wise fighters. And so Patton, kind of almost walks away with his tail between the legs that, this thing just got stopped cold. And Patton's even getting it in the press. They're calling him Blood and Thunder, which kind of irks him because that's not his nickname. And so, he goes back to the drawing board and, is trying to figure out how to make this work. And one of the things he does on April 1st is he moves his headquarters about 5 miles closer to the front. Now, this is something that Eisenhower specifically told him not to do. He said, I want a corps commander, not a casualty. But Patton does move his headquarters closer to the front. And sure enough, he comes up to a ridge and starts setting up his headquarters with his whole staff. And some German artillery shells come in. They're at an angle that, he's safe from. But he orders a private, to kind of run up the hill and see where the Germans are on the other side. And it's when the private's running up that the shells come down, and he yells at this guy. His name's Copeland. And he says, get back here, you idiot. The Germans saw you on top of that hill. And Copeland comes back. He says, no, sir, I made it halfway up the hill. The Germans aren't on the other side. They're atop that hill. And Patton doesn't believe him. And sure enough, 20 minutes later, the Luftwaffe raids Patton's new headquarters. And that is when Dick Jensen, his captain, I think we have another picture of Dick Jensen. I don't know if I sent that to you.
I don't know. Maybe
not.
I'll put the one up, the one of Eddie, of Benson again, so we can see. I'll try and find it. I can't remember if you sent me one or not.
Let's do this. Let's go to the picture of Patton with who's he got there? Terry Allen and Teddy Roosevelt. So you get an idea. So this is the most aggressive infantry division in North Africa. Terry Allen has been fighting since November 8th, and both him and Roosevelt are veterans of World War I. Patton yells at them a lot, but I think he really does respect them. And he kept really expecting them to make the breakthrough. In fact, that picture is taken right around the time of El Guettar. Like I mentioned, it was a defensive victory. So you can see them ensconced, in in a trench right there that Patton did not pee in. It's a very famous story that he shows up at Terry Allen's headquarters and asks him where his foxhole is. And, when Allen points it out, Patton goes over and drops his fly and urinates in it. And supposedly he could hear the clicks of safeties from rifles going off because that really ticked off Allen's troops. But to Patton's credit, he got the heck out of there. The next picture, number 3 should be, that's Orlando Ward. Yeah. And then the next photo is another good picture of what Patton looks like in North Africa. That's number 4. That's him with Hugh Gaffney.
Let me have a look. Hang on. Because they're different numbers in my screen.
Why do you mess them up, Paul? I go, Adam, I was up 7 hours last night getting these all perfect.
Whatever, because the next one for me is the tank one, but
yeah.
Tell me when to stop then. Which one do you want?
I just stop and go backwards. We're fine. Go back.
We're looking for 2 seasoned professionals at this. We're very very amateurish today, but I don't really care. It's Monday and whatever.
That's right. Here we are using Radio Shack computers, right? So typical German Mark IV tank. This is what Task Force Benson is up against. And so I mentioned that. He gets Dick Jensen killed. Up trying to get up front closer to the fighting. And so Patton gets so angry about this. He basically tells Benson, I want you to keep going. Even if you lose 10 tanks, just keep pressing forward. And Benson's like, okay, I'll do just that. And goes forward and he loses 8 tanks almost immediately. And to Benson, that's the equivalent of 10 tanks. And he pulls back to Patton's chagrin and anger. And so it just doesn't seem to be working. This Patton has war game this time and time again, but there's just too much German armor, too much smart fighting by the German infantry, too many mines. But Patton's not going to give up. He's going to still press forward. He's going to have, Benson go forward again. This time it's almost like for the last time that he says, you've got to move forward. You've got to make this happen. And in spite of this, the Germans are counterattacking. And at one point, it looks like they're going to take Patton's headquarters and Bradley or get close to it. And Bradley actually recommends he moves back to Farina, which is back, in like almost Algeria. And Patton says, no, I refuse to move. I've never moved before. And that's something that's going to be very distinct in his command in the future. And so he's going to, give Benson one more try. And he's like, you either, get killed or you get to the water. That's basically his attitude. You've got to cut off the Germans to help Montgomery, who's coming up from the south. And we've got to do this before Montgomery arrives. The prestige of the U.S. Army is on the line. So going to the next photograph.
And Great Dominion, who's a regular viewer, is saying that he's using the language, he walked right into Rommel's trap. So not just that there's a defensive line, that actually the German forces are almost wanting this advance to come in because they are so well prepared, they're going to kind of catch them unawares. What's your take on the use of the word trap?
Well, first, we don't want to use the word Rommel. Rommel is gone. General von Arnim is in charge. I think because of the movie Patton, a lot of people keep thinking, oh, it's Rommel's plan. Von Arnim really didn't, take anything from Rommel. He was fighting his own war. As far as falling into a German trap, I would disagree with that because the bulk of German forces are facing Montgomery. The American Second Corps is not the only corps on the line. It's probably the most powerful one, but there's a British Corps and a French Corps. And the idea is to draw the Germans towards you so that you're freeing up Montgomery and like giving him room to maneuver. So, is he falling into a German trap? Well, part of his orders are to engage the Germans, be a light to a bunch of flies, get them to gather.
This is the lesson that, and again, I'm going to mention Normandy and the later Italian campaign. This is what the Allies learn, is that you've got to provide that pressure on the German line, and then the Germans tend to then counterattack in some shape or form. And then that's when we can use the things like we have, like tank destroyers or air power, whatever, to then hit the Germans when they come out of their positions. So this is, the ongoing theme of these shows has been that torch is a massive, great learning curve for the later campaigns. Everybody is getting they're getting something out of the successes, but they're learning more from the setbacks in many ways.
Yes, you learn sometimes more from your mistakes than from your success.
Yeah.
So what was I was preaching?
You were about to talk about the photo, yeah.
Yeah. So there's Benson. This is the day before the launch. And that's Benson. He's got his back to us. And so you can kind of see the terrain in the background. This is not all flat land. It's very good defensively, particularly for the Germans. They've got the terrain is to their advantage. And, that's why they called it, the Battle of Kasserine Pass and all these things, because there's all these jagged cliffs. And the only way through are these just narrow pathways. And so, Kasserine is not the only pass in the area. There's a whole bunch of them. But that's the kind of terrain we're facing. It's almost like, fighting east or west across the Appalachian Mountains in the United States. They're not with us. They're not channeling, our way. They're blocking us like a series of walls.
Yeah.
Let's go to the next photo.
And you can see it again in the rear of that photo as well.
Yeah. And you can tell these guys are enjoying a delicious lunch because that's the way you ate your lunch in the North African desert. Next photo. And by the way, all these photos come from Patton's photo album. So yeah, because it is almost impossible to find. It's hard to find good North Africa photographs with the U.S. Army. It's like we're still on our baby feet, learning how to do things. And so I've had to rely on Patton's personal photos to really get an image, to get these images. So this is kind of an interesting one. This is the death of a bunch of Germans, of a German stronghold. And what Patton talks about in his diaries and letters is that he is using for this fight phosphorus. And so, they would drop phosphorus on an area, hoping it would get that. Now he says to get the Germans to move, and then they could fire artillery. In a lot of cases, phosphorus was sort of against the Geneva Convention. You're only supposed to use phosphorus, and that's because when it touches the skin, it burns. You're only supposed to use it to destroy equipment. But on the battlefield, those rules are kind of, I guess, ignored. And so by dropping phosphorus rounds on the Germans, they're able to kill them a little bit faster and, more efficiently. And Patton talks about how, all this different artillery wasn't working. And then and he credits himself as using phosphorus on the battlefield and that finally breaking up German formation. So you can kind of see the results of phosphorus fire. It just knocked out this German defensive position and we just wiped it out. So there's Benson. So I think also when people think of the American Army in North Africa, they're thinking of Sherman tanks. They are still arriving onto the battlefield. And so we're using a lot of Lee tanks here. And so what Benson has done is taken the turret off. And so this is definitely an obsolete tank. I mean, the turret, and I think a 37 millimeter, which really wasn't powerful for anything. The main gun, as you can see, is low velocity, and it's tucked into the side of the tank, so it doesn't have that maneuverability to fire. A German could easily sneak up on its left flank. And then thirdly, you can see all the rivets in it, all the bolts holding it together. So if a German round even glances off the tank, it's going to drive all those rivets into the tank and kill the crew. The American Army or the American industry just did not have the technology for a heavy turret to encase a large cannon. Of course, we will, but at this point, it's still in development and just arriving on the battlefield.
I mean, Jeff Danby made that point on Friday because the 756 tank battalion, they have welded hull Stuarts, but they are about the first to get welded hulls. As you say there, the technology is available, but it's not reached the front line yet. It's not Torch is where, or Tunisia is where the US Army is beginning to get all of its new toys, but it won't have them all yet until you get even to Sicily and Italy and perhaps beyond. But while we got that, the photo of the terrain, because you mentioned earlier, Kevin, about Patton had war gamed this scenario a lot and how he'd served alongside Benson before. Because you've written about, we're talking about the battle, but you've gone to great lengths to try to understand as best as anybody can understand just who the fuck Patton is. Because I don't know that Patton himself quite knew who General Patton was. But in principle, given that his love of history, given that he's belief in reincarnation, how much that these kind of battlefields, you're not far from places like Carthage. You're not far from places that he would have read about. Was this his quote unquote favorite battlefield? In that it is. There's a lot of theoretical principles he can draw on from his reading.
Yeah, so I wouldn't say so. I think this was so immediate. He was so craving to get into the action. He was kind of cooling his heels in Morocco, and this comes out of nowhere. Hey, you're in command. And he's so busy reacting. I've never really got a sense of him saying, like, this is where I want to fight. It's really his frustration that he doesn't have the tools to fight that he wants. And it's finally when he gets to France and the armored divisions come in and the well-trained infantry, and he leads them on that just, hell for leather tear across France, that he's really in his element because he's got the tools he wants. A big problem with the American armored forces early in the war, we base them off of the cavalry, so they're this fast moving, lots of tanks, get them going. And, it's not working in the desert. And so the thinkers, not Patton, back in the United States, they sit down and what they come up with is called a triangular division, where instead of having two big, battalions, you have 3 combat commands, or 2 regiments, you have 3 combat commands. And instead of like a whole bunch of tanks, it's this real balanced mix of tanks, infantry, and artillery. So they're these sort of self-contained little armor forces, but they've got a little bit of everything. And those are the units that are really going to get results in France, Belgium, Luxembourg, and Germany. So we're really kind of trying to come to grips with how to fight this war. And Patton's frustrations about what he's not capable of doing really detracts. So no, he does not feel this is the ideal battlefield.
And there were several people discussing in the sidebar that Rick Atkinson's army at dawn, for example, is not particularly favourable to Patton in North Africa and Tunisia, and so other books are, and we must be clear that your books of Patton are neither a celebration or a criticism. That you try and find that mid ground, because I know over the years you struggle yourself with exactly what you think of the guy, because he is so complicated. We've talked about it before on the channel. You read about something he does, it's brilliant. You go, well, there you are. I'm liking him again. Then you read about something stupid. You go, yeah, no, that's it. He's gone back into my bad books again. And you must struggle with this on a pretty hourly basis. Yeah,
well, especially since I found his actual diaries and came to learn that his wife had embellished the diaries that Martin Blummenson and every historian since 1953 have used. And so, in his actual diaries, he's using the N word. He's much more anti-Semitic. He's not making these great predictions, that we think he makes. He does not predict the Battle of the Bulge. It catches him completely off guard, and he doesn't have these like opinions of everybody that, he's a perfect judge of everyone else's character. The embellished diary that his wife Beatrice put together. General Lee, the head of ComZ, comes into his office and he's like, oh, Lee doesn't know what he's doing. He's an SOB, blah, 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 blah. Like a whole paragraph about Lee's character. And then you go to the actual handwritten diary and it says General Lee came to visit. That's it.
So all the character assessment has been added later on. But I'll put it up on the screen there. Bradley is saying, I think your books, Kevin, are the most balanced view of Patton I've ever read in 40 years of reading about the man. So there you are.
I don't want to brag.
You can put the crown on.
Don't want to brag. I don't want to say I'm the king of Patton, but
I mean, and this, you've hit it on we're going down a bit of a rabbit hole, and you and I are just talking about Patton now. We will get back to the battle, but you've already hinted at the fact that he's got these ideas of aggression and speed and hitting weak points, which is kind of key to his way of thinking. And indeed, it is something that we allies will have to get to grips with if we're going to win this war. You've also hinted at the fact that his tech hasn't maybe caught up with his ideas yet. That's another kind of aspect from the Tunisia campaign. And also, he's maybe underestimated how good the Germans are. Would you agree with those 3 points at the moment?
I wouldn't say the tech hasn't caught up with him. I would say that the German tech has superseded him.
Okay, yeah, right.
He's been working with the same tech for the last couple of years, thinking we've got the best equipment, we got the best everything, and then pow, the Germans have it a lot better than us. We've got it, we have some catching up to do. But yes, he definitely, and I point this out, Omar Bradley spends his downtime doing math problems to relax. Eisenhower reads Western dime novels. Patton studies military history in his free time. That's all he does.
Yeah, I can relate to that. In apart from football, I think to myself, I won't read World War II tonight, and then I go and pick up a World War II book, and then I read World War II again. So I can kind of relate to that. Although I'm not.
I can honestly
comparing
say
myself to
I've never
Patton.
done a math problem to relax.
No, definitely not. So we'll move back because I think this with this photo here, at the first glance, there's nothing to see in it. But there's, you know, when I looked at it a second time, there's the ridge in the background, and then there's these really obvious track, stroke, road, stroke, highways through it. So tell us a little bit about the assessment as a military historian of the terrain that Task Force Benson is going through. I mean, you've mentioned the fact that this range of hills is ahead of, you know, they've got to go through the passes, but, you know, give us a rundown of the terrain. Can you go across open country? Do you need to use tracks? Give us an assessment.
Right. No, you can go across open country. And, you know, all terrain begs a solution, I guess would be the best way to put it. But Patton doesn't have the solutions here. Now, by the way, so that road you're looking at going across, there's some black dots over by the right. Those are German tanks, and there's also some German tanks on the left. Those what those other black dots are. Patton flew over the battlefield basically when the campaign ended and took hundreds of photographs, and that's what I'm relying on here. So, you know, if Patton was in Europe and he saw this terrain, he would turn to O.P. Weiland and say, hey, have your fighter pilots drop napalm all over that high ground, you know, while my tanks are rolling towards it. And that's exactly what would happen. In North Africa, it took like an hour to get, you know, if you said, hey, we have a German position, we need air cover, it would take almost an hour to get planes over the battlefield. That coordination of air-ground support did not exist in North Africa. The air forces were focused on over-the-horizon attacks, getting supply lines and resupply. Just the idea of being hand in glove with the ground forces did not exist. So, yeah, you are basically naked on these kind of attacks, and there is no outsmarting the enemy at this point. You know, he knows you're coming. There's nothing to hide behind. It's just going to take aggressive forward attacks, and that's what Patton realizes. Like, it's not going to be elan or grace or brilliant maneuvering. It's we got to cover this flat ground as fast as possible, take those heights, or at least penetrate beyond them. In order to give the relief to Montgomery that he's seeking. You know, and basically that is what happens on April 7th. And it's not the way Patton had planned it. It's not the way Army doctrine claims it. It's almost embarrassing how we succeed, how the United States Second Corps succeeds. Because what happens is Patton, you know, rolls up on Benson to check on his progress. And this is just the worst timing ever. Benson's sitting down eating lunch. And of course, Patton goes ballistic. What are you doing? Get off your ass. And, you know, they come to a minefield. And so the Benson's tankers are very cautious about that. So what does the 3-star Corps commander do? Well, he orders his driver forward. And he leads the entire Benson force through the minefield into the German lines, you know, and he does this for you know, more than an hour. And then he finally leans over to his driver and says, you know what, turn around and get out of here. I'm afraid we're going to encounter the British. And if the first person they see is a 3-star general leading the troops, it'll be a national humiliation. So the driver turns around, and within 10 minutes of this is when Benson force meets up at Bloody Akkarit with the British. The noose has been tied, basically. But you know, it's interesting. If you go to Rick Atkinson, if you go to any books on North Africa, when it comes to the link up with the British, everything turns very vague. They'll say like, and then at Bloody Akkarit, American troops met up. They don't say 1st Infantry. They don't say Benson Force. They don't say 9th. They just say, and I always wondered why that was until I found that entry, you know, and then it kind of made sense why we didn't play up which unit met up with the British and why, because George S. Patton was really leading the troops.
Wow. That's a great little detail there. We've got a couple more photos to go, and then we'll do a final assessment of the battle.
Yep.
So what are we looking at here?
So I think this is a perfect example of not just the terrain, but the climate. I think when people think of Africa, North Africa, they think of the desert and, shorts and short sleeve shirts. In Tunisia, the weather was very, very harsh. Patton would come back to his headquarters caked in mud. Both of these soldiers, and Patton doesn't identify who they are, but he just says, their faces are covered with dust. And that was basically, and you could see the vehicle rolling behind him and how it's kicking up all that dust. And that's why it's so white behind it. So guys and vehicles are always choking on dust. Even when it gets warm, Patton orders that you've got to wear long sleeves and long pants, because when the sun goes down, it's going to be freezing, and better to be warm at night and uncomfortable during the day than freezing at night. And so, once again, this is all a learning process for the United States Army. And, and this, Paul, that it was a big battle between George C. Marshall and the British, that Marshall wanted to go into France in 1942. And the British are like, you guys don't know what you're doing, and it's really Roosevelt who says, we'll go into North Africa, because Roosevelt wants to show Joseph Stalin, hey, we're in this fight. We're going to give you any kind of relief we can. And North Africa is just basically, I hate to, I don't want to denigrate it, but it's just a great training ground for the U.S. Army, where it learns how to fight. It learns how to engage with the enemy. They realize what equipment works, what doesn't. You got the Jeep that turns out to be a godsend. And so, yeah, it's really the learning place. And so Patton really does come out the victor. He really does look good in this, that he takes this unit that had been just mauled by the Germans and kind of, helps it stand back up. I don't want to, flourish too much on it. He definitely walked around and was almost crazy with his discipline. But, Terry Allen's a very good, commander. So is Mantonetti. I think Ward is underrated. So there really were good commanders in the Army. But all of that focus kind of gets onto one man, and that's Patton. And the fact that, he can say at the end of the day, hey, I haven't lost a battle against these Axis forces yet. And that's kind of that, I don't want to say myth, because it's true, but that's kind of that stature of Patton that the Germans are going to start to worry about, because he's the one guy they can't defeat.
Interesting sound. It is interesting as well, and it's been a recurring theme of this series, and we're only halfway through it, is that every historian's kind of summary of the Torch and to Tunis campaign is slightly different, where we all define Operation Overlord as the commencing of the Second Front. But people describe this as, is it about the naval stranglehold in the Mediterranean? Is it about testing and trying out equipment? Is it about helping Stalin? Is it about stretching? And it's all of the above and other things as well. And every historian has a slightly different focus on what they think. And some of that is based on how they perceive it at the time, but also how we perceive it 80 years later for the particular aspect that historian is looking at. Trevor Sheehan is watching tonight. Will be doing a lot of his focus next week will be on his really good assessment of the terrain, because he's been there a lot and has walked that ground. Other people, Vince O'Hara on Saturday, it was about the naval lessons learned. So it seems we all use this campaign for slightly different reasons, depending on where our kind of main focus is.
Right. And Paul, I think you and I have talked about this before. I've seen this progression in American military history, but I'm sure it goes back to the Greeks and the Romans, that, immediately after a war, all the generals write their memoirs. Yeah. And man, they are not critical of themselves. They realize they got to defend themselves. And then the sort of next generation tends to be their children, who look at these guys as heroes and write the books, with that sort of angle that, my dad was in the best unit in the biggest battle. And then you get to that third generation where things start to become declassified and objective trained historians are picking this stuff apart. And you get this sort of the sort of more of a bedrock history that I hope future scholars use, and that's been the basis of a lot of my books my 2 books on Patton, in this 3-volume series, because I was able to go and access soldier interviews and soldier surveys. And so I was able to place Patton in places that we didn't know that he was there. And, he was saying things we didn't know he said. And so it gives that other dimension that a autobiography really lacks.
Yeah, and I always make the point when people, because sometimes I appear to be overly critical of some of those kind of post-war generals' memoirs, as I'm sometimes overly critical of the 70s, 80s writings of your Hastings and D'Estaing and Blumenson and stuff. But I'm not, because I wouldn't ever not want those books on my shelves, because it's the understanding of the progression. It's the understanding of that's what this generation of historians thought for at the time, possibly or probably good reasons. Here's what the current crop of historians think for also interesting reasons. And in 20 years' time, someone will be reassessing your work and saying, but now we think of this because there'll have been some other study done. And, you know, I still always refer to what Professor Frank McDonough said to me ages ago, one of the early shows on World War II TV about his 2-volume study about the rise of the Third Reich, is he said, I fully expect my books to be out of date within 10 years, and I'd like them to be out of date within 5, because it means that the work will have been done to revise. And, you know, we've talked about it a lot, that the word, you know, revisionist history. Revisionist is used as a dirty word. I think it's a positive word. Revisionist means you found something with the argument that you would like to examine and add to. So if someone wants to take what you've written in 20 years' time and say, I really liked what this historian said, but I'm going to put this thought into my readers' heads and give a different alternative view, you'll be as interested in reading that as I will.
Yep. And I always say I stand on the shoulders of D'Estaing and Blumenson, because I never been able to do my research and my work without being inspired by their great writing and their research. You know, and I would hope too that someday I become obsolete. I just hope that some historian doesn't go, what was that Kevin Hymel guy thinking? You know?
Yeah, you don't want to be completely, you know, just roasted. I mean, none of us wants to happen to us what happened to kind of Stephen Ambrose, where he's almost now not talked about at all, isn't he? That
I don't know who you're talking
elephant
about,
in the room of Stephen Ambrose now is really, you know, we all owe him a debt because of the popularizing of history. But now he's kind of, universities don't talk about Ambrose now, and at least you want to be talked about, even if it's negatively, even if they say Kevin's books are crap, but at least you're being talked about.
That's right.
I'm just judging now, but we had some questions about, are these Italian field guns in the photo there?
Yeah, Patton just said these are little anti-tank guns, and so I think that is a perfect way of referring to Italian equipment, because it was so lightweight compared to the heavy-duty German stuff, because, you know, they're fighting the war on the Russian front and increasing the size of their tanks, their anti-tank guns, anti-aircraft guns. And so this is sort of the fruits of victory from Task Force Benson. You know, to my knowledge, there was only one Italian division that we were really facing, that Patton was facing. I think it was the Centauro division. In fact, when Patton launches his first attack to take Gasfa, it's really a walkover, but everybody's nervous. You know, this is the first time the American Army's gone on the offensive since Kasserine. And when Patton goes to name the operation to take it from the Italians, he calls it Operation WAP, which is a very derogatory term for Italian, but that's very much Patton. You know, if there's an ethnic slur he hasn't met and embraced, I don't know what it is.
Yeah, no, definitely. And you know, and there is Patton at the end of it, and that was the cover of your Patton's photographs book, wasn't it? I think.
No, Patton's photographs has him wearing a camera in.
That's the cover of one book. Is that Blumenson's book?
Yes, that's Patton.
I knew it's the cover of a book then.
Yeah,
and we'll ask you to kind of sum up the battle, and we'll also, I mean, I'll move back to the slide in a minute, but because Benson did receive the Silver Star for this, so he was. It's like you'd have thought as a colonel he might have got a Distinguished Service Cross, but who wrote up the award? Was it Patton?
It would have had to have been Patton. Yeah, nobody else had the authority to do that. And then, you know, he gets the Silver Star, but he then disappeared. I mean, maybe he does great things in Italy with First Armored, but, you know, I really don't see his name in the history books really since after that. So I don't really know the results of what happened to old Benson there. But we were saying how in the Green books, I mean, there's only so much on Task Force Benson. In fact, I even went through the Library of Congress veteran interviews, trying to find veterans from First Armored in the North Africa campaign. I couldn't find anything, you know. So, yeah, it wasn't for a lack of trying. But, you know, I think that photograph really does kind of sum things up well. You know, that's Patton in charge. He's got the ivory-handled pistol at his hip. He's close enough to the action where he sees explosions on the horizon. For all we know, maybe he's looking at Task Force Benson there. that photograph, was used heavily in 1942 and made it to a lot of newspapers. But the cut line, and I've seen it in different forms, both through Army Signal Corps and through Office of War Information. Those are the two I always really count on when I go to the archives. The cut line for that, or the caption, is very generic because they don't want to reveal where the fighting is, and especially North Africa, like with Europe, we know where Paris is, we know Berlin, we know a lot of the towns, but North Africa the Americans are very ignorant of North Africa. And so they don't even bother in a lot of the cut lines for action all over the place. Do they really mention just North African desert? They don't even say what country it is. So it's hard to really piece those photographs with the story of the campaign. Okay,
so I'm going to put the map up there again, and I'd like you now to just kind of summarize Task Force Benson. And indeed, when we talking about you coming on as part of this series, that this is what you suggested to talk about. So you clearly think it has merit. It's important in either Patton's career or the campaign in North Africa. So give us a summary.
Sure, and I would say that Task Force Benson is very, how do I say this, almost like iconic of Patton, that when he is faced with almost an impossible situation where nothing's working, he's going to come up with an idea to break the stalemate, to flank the enemy. We're going to see that in Sicily, where he employs the U.S. Navy to take his troops hopscotching along the northern side of Sicily. He always finds a way. Where any sane general would have stopped in several locations in France, he goes until his fuel runs out. And you know what? Half the time they overtake German fuel depots and can use the German fuel. So he's always looking for that advantage, always refusing to say, you know what, I'm boxed in, I got to stop. And so if we look at this map, you can see El Guettar on the far left or on the west. And you can see that offensive starting from El Guettar. El Guettar is a defensive victory, but it enables Patton to go on the offensive. And so you can see the sweep that he's going with, and you're adding in units of the 9th Infantry in the south, the 1st Infantry in the north. But you can see the brutal terrain they're going against, those hills. And Patton's belief is once that infantry kind of can break that crust and get the Germans moving back, then you send Task Force Benson in, you get behind the German lines, and you run amok. Now, Patton was nervous because these troops are green, that he was afraid that he was going to send Benson in there and the Germans would just close off the gap right behind him. But that is roughly, for as many times as it doesn't work, for the first 5 or 6 times. On the 7th time, with Patton leading the way, the unit succeeds, it's pay dirt, and basically rolls up the Germans and greets the British. And then all of this is in 1 week's time.
Yeah, and you made the point yourself. In sporting terms, if we're talking about soccer, because Ipswich have been promoted to the Championship, I'm talking about football again, folks, is that he's a player who never goes sideways or backwards. He always goes forwards. And sometimes, as we know, that causes Patton to run into all sorts of problems. But it's hard to criticize someone who always wants to be going forward, who always, you say that, always tries to find that solution, always persists, even if sometimes it's doubling down on something that shouldn't work, and other commanders might have possibly, for better reasons, pulled back and try to rejig the idea. For whatever reason, Patton isn't that kind of person. The Patton is, this is the situation, I'm going to make the best of it, and I will put something else into this until it comes out the way I want it to.
And who notices this? The enemy.
Yeah.
The Germans will come to appreciate, hey, up against Patton, we've got someone who's always going to be on the offensive, to the point where when they're planning the Battle of the Bulge, General Brandenburg, 7th Army, says, hey, wait a second, I'm the army in the south. I got Patton south of me. I've studied him. I've studied his army. He's going to turn and hit me as soon as we start moving. And he was actually giving Patton more credit than he deserved. Patton stalled for a few days, but that's exactly what happens once Patton gets an idea of how bad the bulge is. So the Germans, more than anybody, take note that, this guy, whatever his faults are, he's always looking to attack. And I don't know about you, but I've interviewed a lot of soldiers that were like, who weren't in 3rd Army. And they said, oh, we didn't want to be in 3rd Army. Patton would keep you moving the whole time. You never get any sleep. And Patton's like, well, yeah, I'd rather you be exhausted and win quickly then get you a lot of sleep, and then drag the war out. And that was really his philosophy, to really push, because the faster you end the war, the more lives you save.
Yeah, definitely. And well, we'll do some questions if you don't mind, Kevin. So Jim is asking, could we say that North Africa is where the US Army learned everything from supply to fighting and everything in between?
That's a bold statement. I would say generally yes. But we never really did get the grip on the air support for ground troops in North Africa. That's something that's going to come later. I don't know that we ever really licked the logistics problem that haunts us in Europe. But as far as coming to grips with the enemy, I would say yes. And learning that there is a problem that needs fixing. But yeah, I think the best training ground in World War II Europe was North Africa.
And Peter O'Connell, he asked this question a couple of times with other guests, and we didn't always get to his questions because we didn't. But he's saying, any comment on what the Axis could possibly have been thinking about by reinforcing Tunisia in context of their repeated failures in North Africa?
I would say it was more knee-jerk reaction than strategy.
Right.
Operation Torch lands so many troops into North Africa. Hitler felt like he had to do something, and so they actually rush troops in by air, and they're very successful in doing that, and they're capable of stalling the Americans from the punch that they want to deliver in Tunisia. So that knee-jerk reaction is correct initially, but then all of a sudden you've got an entire army trapped with an ocean or a sea between you and them. So maybe if things had gone better initially when the Germans got over there, they could have kept some kind of corridor open, but Hitler should have known. He just didn't have the sea power, the air power, anything to keep a way of getting the troops out as quickly as they got them in. So,
brilliant.
Yeah.
And David Kay is making the point that Benson retired as a colonel perhaps indicates trouble with the promotion process of that era, because, yeah, I mean, yeah.
I wouldn't go down that route because you just never know. He's an older guy. Combat is very stressful. It may have gotten to him. He may have departed the U.S. military for medical reasons. So I would never want to make an assumption like that.
Okay. Trevor, who's on again next week, is reminding us that von Stauffenberg was just north of Task Force Benson. So, of course, from the Valkyrie plot there, he was in that battle there. And another thing, because we talked about Terry Allen, and I know Terry Allen lasts as far as Husky, but he doesn't make it beyond that. And we talk about the continuity of how many commanders went through Torch and carried on doing things, but there were some casualties. You talked about Ward earlier on, and Allen doesn't make so there are some heads that roll as the result of Torch and Husky.
Oh yeah. Now, I wouldn't put Terry Allen in the head rolling department, because
no.
That's what my research found, is that Omar Bradley's memoir, where he talks about relieving Allen, is complete fiction. That Marshall, and we all know this, said, hey, we need seasoned commanders to come back to the States and train the army. I want Terry Allen. And Patton says, no, I need him for Sicily. And he said, okay, you can have him initially for Sicily, but once you're settled, then he has to come home. So Terry Allen knew he was going home before he went into Sicily. And I think, Omar Bradley's memoir is just a lot of fluff. In fact, to reinforce this, I was going through, we talked about the Army Green books, and I was going through it at the National Archives. You can order the boxes of notes and rough drafts. And I was going through I couldn't even remember which Green book it was. I think it was Breakout and Pursuit. And in the interviews they were doing with generals, two of them said, hey, by the way, this isn't having to do with us, but Terry Allen was sent home to train, the American Army. Then he was supposed to come back as a corps commander. And I had two generals saying, yeah, that's all those other stories are bunk. That's really what the plan was. And so I included that in my book. The question is, why did Terry Allen only return as a division commander? And I think Terry Allen had a drinking problem. And I think that's what prevented him from going any higher. I don't want to say it definitively, but there's definitely evidence of him having a drinking problem. So yeah, Terry Allen, that's one of the joys of the Patton book research, is I was able to cut through a lot of myths, which I believe a historian even mentioned on the back of a book recently that I cut.
Oh, was that me? Yeah, I'm on the blurb, top blurb on the back of Kevin's book. Yeah, so I'm unashamedly a Kevin fan, and yeah, and it's interesting that some of these figures like Terry Allen and that they've been given a view in a criticism or an assessment in history that has become kind of carved in stone over the years, and it's time that, because then I'm not calling them lesser figures as such, but they're further down our understanding than the likes of Eisenhower and Montgomery and MacArthur. But some of these figures, you look them up on the internet, and they have some quite blunt things said about them that probably are due for reinterpretation.
And Paul, I'm going to jump back real quick. We were talking about Blumenson, D'Este, all those historians of the previous generation. I was talking to the people at the Library of Congress now that the book's out, and they were telling me, so during the pandemic, the members of the Library of Congress decided to translate Patton's diaries word for word and put them up on the internet. Anybody can look at them now. And what I came to find out is when the Patton family gave the papers to the Library of Congress, they gave his regular diary, the handwritten diaries, and the typed up, embellished diaries. They left specific instructions that the handwritten diaries were not to be looked at for like 30 years or something. So D'Este and Blumenson did not have access to the original diaries. I'm sure they would have tackled them if they had the opportunity.
Yeah.
But the Patton family blocked that.
Understandably. Yeah, so we'll do a few more questions. So a quick one. So Andreas is asking, what time frame does the second book cover? And while we're at that, what will the third book cover?
Yeah, so I'm gonna go through all three. First one covers November 8th, 1942, all the way to July 31st, 1944, right before Third Army becomes active on the continent. And then volume 2 is going to cover basically August 1st, 1944 to December 31st, 1944. So sweep across France, the battles for Metz, the relief of Bastogne, and then the drive up towards Houffalize. And then volume 3 is going to be January 1st, 1945 to, I think, May 9th, 1945, to the end of the war. I will probably add a chapter about what Patton did after the war. I think I'm going to have a chapter about the car accident, just because
if you don't address it, people will say, why didn't you address it?
And there's just so many stupid, theories out there that I feel like I need to knock them down. And really, these 3 books are an analysis of Patton's combat leadership. So I really don't, exploring the car accident is just icing on the cake. Yeah. But like I said, I'm on chapter 3 of volume 3. So I hope no one's holding their breath. But hopefully people will read volume 2 very slowly. That's
definitely, yeah, good to give you time to finish the third one. So Bradley is on, I guess this is about North Africa. Do you think Patton was too focused on tactics and lost focus of the strategic view at times?
He's commanding an entire army when he gets to Europe, and he constantly talks in his diaries and letters about things that are going on above him. Mostly it's anger and rage, that he really is critical of Montgomery. He feels that Montgomery is able to bend Eisenhower to his will. He's saying, I can do X, Y, and Z, but they're not letting me. They're giving it to Montgomery. And, that's assuming the strategic thinking above Patton is correct. And, you can look at Market Garden as an example of things not going well. So I would say, but really on a day-to-day basis, Patton is really focused on what's in front of him, which is what an army commander or any unit, commander should do. And really did not think of the strategic thing, anything above his pay grade. In fact, when he comes up with a certain idea of how to fight the war, I guess the latest campaign in, I guess, September of 44, he goes to tell Bradley, and Bradley's not there. He's gone to see Montgomery and Eisenhower to talk about what they're going to do. And I think it's Ian Hamilton. Is he the biographer for Montgomery?
Possibly.
I
don't have that one. If there is one by Hamilton.
Nigel Hamilton.
Oh, yes. Yeah.
So Nigel's very critical of Patton. He said, Patton should have flown up to that meeting, because if he had done that, they would have, seen what his idea was, and it could have changed the war. But Patton knew his role. He wasn't going to go barge into a meeting. He was worried every day that Eisenhower was going to send him home. He's like, I'm an army commander. it's not my place to go barging into these meetings. So I think he fought the correct war for his level of what he should have been doing.
Okay, thank you. And Sean is asked, going back to Benson, when Task Force Benson went forward and almost immediately lost 8 tanks, what caused the tank losses? Mines, packs, artillery?
Well, you and I were talking about this earlier, Paul. So the Patton says it was really mostly landmines. But, we were talking earlier about how the British, when they first encountered German 88s, they thought it was landmines because they just couldn't believe they were getting knocked out so rapidly by German artillery. So I think very much so it could have been German artillery firing on them.
And Greg Nguyen is reminding, if you don't become address the conspiracy theory about then people will assume you've got a dog in the fight. So
That's right.
You'll have to say something about it.
My silence will make me guilty.
Yeah, exactly. So, well, I think we will bring things to an end, but we will see you again at some point because, you still hold the record of having the most popular show on World War II TV because of the Carenton attack one we did, which is now up to 448,000 views, Kevin. So 1/8 of all my viewers have watched you. Or, well, in fact, you weren't on that one on screen. You were narrating that one. So.
Right. So that was.
So there are there. So there's when we can see you, less people watch. That's interesting. I don't know what that's when they can't see me either because I wasn't on screen either. So there we are. We should do more without us on screen. Therefore.
So I always say that I have a face for radio and a voice for writing.
Yeah, maybe. No, it was. But thanks for being part of that early success on the channel. We are April.
Let's talk about that real quick, Paul, because what that was, you would help me with that. I did research on the entire Carentan campaign, but did it through the eyes of Easy Company, but added, so you really got an idea of the streets being crossed and how they went through the city. And you called me up and said, hey, I'm starting this channel. I'm just kind of coming to grips with it. Would you go into a studio and read that article? And then I will put pictures and things like that. And it was just a really enjoyable experience. So I was really happy that it's popular as it is today.
I mean, we winged it, really. I mean, you'd written the article, but I didn't know what I was doing in terms of putting videos together. I didn't know what the channel, which direction it was going to go. And you had faith in me. I had faith in you, but it is the most viewed program, which is interesting. So
got something wrong in the article.
Sorry.
Remember that I got the company commander for Fox Company wrong, and you had to pull it and re-edit it. So
that's right. Yeah. We had one more question about that, whether or not, it was Benjamin asked about whether or not there's still room for an updated single volume appraisal of Patton, biography of Patton, because you've made the point that you're trying to look at him as a combat leader. I mean, whether or not there is room for the one, there will be one. I think
so.
It was Andrew Roberts said there's 1,600 and something other biographies of Churchill, and Patton has to be into the hundreds.
I'll tell you, I found out a lot about Patton in World War I, going through his diaries and letters in World War II. I found out a lot more about Patton in Mexico, going against Pancho Villa, by going through the Patton collection and reading letters and newspaper articles. Because I think the thing that blew me away was when Patton famously shoots down with some other soldiers 3 banditos, generals, whatever you want to. One of them was Cardenas, which was a Pancho Villa general. And they find when they get their horses and stuff and they start taking all the equipment off the horses, they find that they've got blankets from, I think, the 15th Cavalry Regiment. The Mexicans had them. And that was the regiment that got hit in Columbus, New Mexico, which started the whole war. And I thought that was really important. Wow, these guys have stolen equipment from the very beginning of this, what caused this whole campaign. But D'Este, Blumenson, no one else wrote about that. So there is a lot to discover. I just got to move on to other things. I don't want to.
You'll go insane. I don't know whether you've read Al Murray's book Command yet, because he looks at various figures, and obviously Al Murray comes at this from the point of view of being a stand-up comedian and comic and comedy writer. And one of the things that he was able to do that is perhaps from his perspective, we're going down a rabbit hole talking about someone else's book, is that he understood that some of these commanders had a public persona and they had a stage character in a sense, and they had the real person. And Al, because that's what he does, Al goes on stage as his character called the pub landlord. And then there's Al Murray, who does podcasts, who's another character. Then there's the Al Murray who's a father and husband and a home guy. And so he was able to understand that when you're looking at someone like Patton, there's the show pattern is probably distinctly different from the guy who writes a diary, who is different again from the guy who actually, you know, says hello to his wife and pats his dog kind of thing. And whereas some generals, it seems that what you're seeing on stage is more the real person. So dissecting Patton, you've got to understand there are more than one Patton in a sense.
And I'll add on with the Al Murray thing, because he talked about it exclusively, you know, at length on his show, which I won't mention because we're on your show right now. But I plan on being on their show very soon. But he talked about Omar Bradley relieving Terry Allen during the show. And I'm like, ugh. And so it's almost like I have difficulty reading other books, having done all this research. And, you know, I hear authors say, oh, and you know, Bradley definitely relieved Allen. And, you know, Patton definitely predicted the Battle of the Bulge. And Willie was named after William the Conqueror, you know, and I hear these things and I'm like, sorry.
Well, that's where we are. But with some of these figures, the big figures, is that the legend is spreads further than sometimes the fact. And we just, you know, we're all guilty of it. I'm guilty of believing things that I thought because they've been in my head for such a long time, they have become ingrained. And then you go back and you realize that, you know, well, what Jeff Danby said on Friday about the 756 Tank Battalion having done all these amphibious landings ahead of going to North Africa, that kind of, I didn't know that bit. I looked at the whole, and my understanding of the whole of American armor in North Africa was that they haven't done much training before, you know, that specialized training, I should point out. So we're learning all the time, and it would be boring if we weren't learning all the time, because there's always that person out there who's done that deeper dive, as you now have spent how many years with another few months to go, dissecting Patton, that you know, there's no end to it. You could keep on going and keep on assessing it, but you know, you'll need to move on to other things, I guess.
I think it was Coach Wooten who said, when you stop being a student, you stop being.
Yeah, no, definitely.
There you go.
Yeah.
What a perfect.
Well, there we are.
Yeah.
We will bring things back, Kevin. So it's been great talking to you. I hope I get to meet you in Normandy at some point. Well, we will do. We're meeting in June, aren't we? Because you're coming over with a group. So I will see you there, and that'll be fantastic. So as always, thanks for joining us. I'm just going to take you off screen, and I'll say goodbye to you in a minute, but I'll take you off screen for a second. So, folks, 2 shows tomorrow. So Glyn Harper is joining me from New Zealand at 9 o'clock UK time, talking about the New Zealand Corps, particularly focusing on the Mareth Line, which is just ahead and sort of coinciding with what Kevin talked about today. And then later in the day, Paul Sparrow is taking us right back to the planning for Torch and how FDR and Churchill and others were looking at that whole political situation. You've realized now, if you've been checking the notifications, I've now scheduled the Michael Nyberg show for next Monday. So it was going to be at the beginning of the series. It's now going to be the final show of the series. It's just one of those things. But actually, it works quite well, because then Michael can then talk about the kind of political implications for France and Vichy and Darlan. So it being at the end of the series actually works just as well as it being at the beginning. So that is now up on schedule. Again, if you are new to the channel, please don't forget to subscribe. 60% of you, I will remind you, have not yet subscribed. So please click that button so you receive notifications. And if you would consider becoming a patron or a YouTube member, that would be fantastic. But I'll bring Kevin back in just to say goodbye. Have you enjoyed talking to us again?
I always enjoy talking to you, Woody. We have a blast, don't we?
We have a blast. And we'll have to do it in person again. We'll have to just sit in a pub and talk about stuff over a beer. It'd be great.
It's been too long.
It's been too long. I don't think we ever sat in a pub, and we've only ever met on battlefields.
I don't think we gave each other hugs in the church once, and
we did that. Anyway, cheers, Kevin. Have a good rest of your day. Cheers, everybody. I will see you for 2 shows tomorrow. This is Paul Winnett for World War II TV saying enjoy the rest of your day. Bye.